He raised a baby rhino alone, and 14 years later, the rhino returned with a debt to repay. Some bonds transcend the boundaries between humans and wild animals, creating connections that defy explanation. This is the extraordinary story of James and Nkosi, a man and a rhino whose lives became intertwined through an act of compassion. What began as a rescue would culminate in a moment of recognition that would save a life when it mattered most. The sound of gunshots echoed through the South African reserve as James, a wildlife veterinarian, raced toward the disturbance. What he found shattered his heart. A female rhino, her horn brutally hacked away, lying motionless in a pool of blood. But the true horror was just beginning. A tiny movement caught James's eye. A trembling baby rhino, no more than 2 weeks old, nudging its mother's lifeless body. "The calf won't survive the night," the ranger told James bluntly. "Even in a sanctuary, orphans this young rarely make it. Nature's cruel that way." James watched the baby's eyes, wide with fear and confusion. In that moment, he made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. "I'll take him home," James announced, ignoring the shocked expressions around him. "I can't let him die out here alone." But saving the baby rhino's life was just the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. James's modest home on the outskirts of the reserve was never meant to house a baby rhinoceros. The first night was a nightmare of bellowing cries and desperate attempts to coax the calf to drink from a makeshift bottle. The tiny rhino paced in confused circles, bumping into furniture and walls, searching for his mother. "Come on, little one," James pleaded, exhaustion etching lines in his face as dawn broke after a sleepless night. "You have to eat, please." The baby rhino, still traumatized from witnessing his mother's death, refused all nourishment. His eyes, surprisingly expressive for such an ancient-looking creature, held a wariness that broke James's heart. Each rejected bottle felt like a personal failure. James called every wildlife expert he knew, emptying his contact list in desperate search of advice. Veterinarians, conservationists, zoo specialists, the prognosis remained universally grim. "A rhino this young needs his mother's milk," his colleague Dr. Mbeki warned during a house call, shaking her head at the sight of the weakening calf. The specialized bacteria in their gut, the antibodies in the milk, it's nearly impossible to replicate. Even with the right formula, the chances are slim. You're setting yourself up for heartbreak, James. "I have to try," James insisted, watching the calf's labored breathing. Every rhino matters now. The unspoken truth hung between them. With poaching decimating rhino populations across Africa, each life represented a species fighting for survival. 3 sleepless days passed in a blur. James's savings dwindled as he purchased specialized equipment and consulted with exotic animal nutritionists from as far away as San Diego and Singapore. His kitchen transformed into a laboratory of formula mixtures. Goat's milk with added nutrients, specialized powders flown in from conservation centers, herbal supplements recommended by local trackers who knew the plants wild rhinos consumed. His living room became a nursery padded with hay and blankets. The smell of rhino and disinfectant permeated everything. Friends stopped visiting, unable to tolerate the barnyard aroma that now defined James's existence. His boss called, questioning when he'd return to his regular veterinary duties. "Take all the leave you need," she said kindly, "but remember, you can't save them all, James." But this one he had to try for. On the 4th night, as James sat on the floor beside the weakening calf, desperation gave way to quiet resignation. The rhino's breathing had grown shallow. His once bright eyes appeared dull. James felt the crushing weight of failure settling over him. Almost without thinking, he began to hum a low, steady tune, something his own mother had sung to him as a child in the Eastern Cape. A lullaby that spoke of stars and protection and the promise of dawn. The baby rhino's ears twitched. James continued, reaching out slowly to stroke the rough, pebbly skin that was surprisingly warm to the touch. And then, a miracle. The calf nudged toward the bottle and began to suckle. Just a little at first, then with increasing vigor. Each pull on the specially designed nipple sent a wave of relief through James so powerful, he felt tears streaming down his face. "That's it, Nkosi," James whispered, naming him with a Zulu word for Lord or Chief. "Fight. You're stronger than you know." The weeks that followed tested James's endurance to its limits. Nkosi required feeding every 2 hours, day and night. His digestive system was delicate, and bouts of illness threatened to undo all progress. Diarrhea could dehydrate the calf within hours. Constipation could signal potentially fatal blockages. Each bodily function became cause for celebration or concern. James slept in short bursts on the floor beside the growing calf, alert to every change in breathing, every unusual sound. His own health began to suffer. Weight dropped from his already lean frame, and dark circles became permanent fixtures under his eyes. Friends brought food he barely remembered eating. His phone filled with missed calls he had no energy to return. His colleagues thought he had lost his mind. "You've gone native," joked a fellow vet when he stopped by with medical supplies. "Next, you'll be growing a horn yourself." James's savings account emptied. Credit card debt mounted. But slowly, undeniably, Nkosi began to thrive. The day the rhino managed to demolish a coffee table during an exuberant morning dash was the day James knew they'd turned a corner. Nkosi's personality emerged. Stubborn, playful, with an unexpected gentleness when James read aloud during evening feedings. A habit that began during a particularly difficult night and somehow stuck. The first time the rhino followed James into the yard, playfully charging at butterflies and investigating flower beds with his sensitive upper lip. James felt a surge of hope that defied all the odds they had overcome. Nkosi's skin, once dull and concerning, now gleamed with health in the sunlight. His eyes, bright and curious, tracked James's movements with unmistakable recognition. "You did it, you magnificent fool," Dr. Mbeki said during her checkup visit 6 weeks after Nkosi's arrival. "I wouldn't have believed it possible." James watched the rhino investigating a patch of clover with methodical determination. "We did it," he corrected. "He's the strongest fighter I've ever met." What James didn't know was that the bond they were forming, this improbable connection between man and rhinoceros, would be tested in ways he could never imagine. The lessons of trust and survival they were teaching each other would one day mean the difference between life and death. For both of them. As months turned into years, Nkosi transformed from a fragile orphan into a formidable young rhino. The tiny, trembling calf, who had once fit in James's living room, now stood nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder, his presence commanding respect with every thunderous step. What had once been bottle feedings and gentle walks around James's yard evolved into massive amounts of vegetation and supervised explorations of the surrounding bushland. "He's getting too big for this place," remarked Thomas, a ranger from the reserve who had become a frequent visitor. He watched as Nkosi casually knocked over a garden shed while scratching an itch against its wooden frame, the structure collapsing with a splintering crash that Nkosi barely seemed to notice. "A rhino needs space, James. And other rhinos." You've done the miraculous getting him this far, but now... The unfinished sentence hung in the air, weighted with truth. James ran a hand through his hair, now streaked with premature gray, a souvenir from 3 years of Rhino parenthood. "I know," James admitted, watching Nkosi demolish a young acacia, stripping its bark with methodical precision. "I've been talking with the reserve about a transition plan." The decision tore at James's heart, but his love for Nkosi demanded honesty. A domestic life was no life for a wild rhinoceros. The small property that had once seemed spacious now resembled a prison. The garden James had once tended was long gone, sacrificed to Nkosi's appetite and play. The neighbors, once supportive of the rescue effort, had grown weary of property damage and the occasional middle-of-the-night alarm when Nkosi decided to patrol the perimeter. At 3 years old, Nkosi weighed over a ton, his presence dominating every corner of James's modest property. The once tiny calf now consumed nearly 100 pounds of vegetation daily, forcing James to supplement his diet with deliveries from local farmers. The small pond James had dug for mud baths was laughably inadequate for Nkosi's growing frame. More puddle than wallow to a rhino of his size. "He deserves to be with his own kind," James said quietly one evening, as he and Dr. Mbeki watched Nkosi from the porch. The young rhino was engaged in a peculiar game of his own invention, charging at a large rubber ball before stopping just short, then spinning with surprising agility to track its bounce. "The reserve has agreed to a gradual reintroduction," James continued. "They've set aside a controlled area where he can adjust while still having human contact. I'll stay with him initially, then scale back as he acclimates." Dr. Mbeki nodded, her expression sympathetic. "It's the right decision, though not an easy one. You've been his entire world, James, and he's been yours." The plan they developed would gradually introduce Nkosi to a protected area of the reserve, allowing him to acclimate to natural surroundings while still maintaining contact with James. The process would take months, possibly years, with no guarantee of success. He might never fully integrate with the other rhinos, warned Dr. Mbeki during one of her preparatory visits. Imprinting is powerful, especially with an orphan raised in isolation from his species. He thinks he's human, or at least that humans are his herd. We've seen cases where reintroduction failed because the animals simply couldn't navigate the social complexities of their own kind. James absorbed this sobering assessment, watching as Nkosi followed the clinic's assistant around the yard, curious about the stranger but keeping a respectful distance. The rhino's behavior was a complex blend of wild instinct and domesticated mannerisms. He would startle at unfamiliar sounds like any wild animal, but would also respond to his name and several basic commands James had taught him. "We'll take it day by day," James resolved. "He deserves the chance to be what he truly is." The preparations consumed the next 3 months. James worked with reserve staff to construct a special transitional enclosure, large enough to feel like freedom, but protected enough to monitor Nkosi's adjustment. They installed camera systems to track his movements when humans weren't present. James recorded his daily routines, feeding preferences and behavioral patterns to help the reserve staff understand Nkosi's unique personality. The first day of transition arrived with a knot of anxiety in James's stomach. Loading Nkosi into the specially reinforced transport vehicle proved easier than expected. The rhino had become accustomed to short trips around the local area, though never this far from home. "It's okay, boy," James murmured, walking alongside the vehicle as it slowly made its way into the reserve. "This is going to be good for you. You'll see." They transported Nkosi to the specially constructed enclosure on the reserve, 20 acres of natural habitat enclosed by nearly invisible fencing, designed to keep Nkosi in while allowing him to experience the sights, sounds, and smells of true wilderness. The area included a small watering hole, various vegetation types, and even a few strategically placed mud wallows. James stayed in a small cabin nearby, spending days helping Nkosi explore his new territory, teaching him which plants were safe to eat, which watering holes were reliable. He noted with pride how quickly Nkosi adapted to browsing natural vegetation, his powerful lips wrapping around branches with increasing skill. At night, the rhino would return to sleep near the cabin, his massive body surprisingly quiet as he settled on the earth outside James's window. The rhythmic sound of his breathing became James's lullaby, a reversal of their earliest days together. "It's like having a 2-ton dog," James joked to Thomas during one of the Rangers' check-ins, though his eyes revealed the emotional complexity of the situation. He still wants his belly scratched before bed. Try explaining to a rhino that your arm isn't long enough anymore. Thomas laughed, but his expression turned serious as he watched Nkosi patrolling the perimeter of his new territory. He's displaying natural behavior, marking boundaries, establishing a home range. That's a good sign. As weeks passed, James gradually extended his absences, allowing Nkosi more independence. The young rhino began venturing further into his enclosure, sometimes not returning to the cabin until the following day. Each separation was both a victory and a small heartbreak for James. 4 months into the transition, the reserve director suggested expanding Nkosi's territory by opening a section of the fence into an adjacent area, one occasionally frequented by other rhinos. "He's ready," the director insisted. "His behavior is increasingly natural. He's foraging properly, mud bathing, even responding to distant rhino calls. We can monitor the interactions carefully." James agreed, though not without trepidation. The night before the fence section was removed, he spent hours with Nkosi, sitting beside the massive animal under a canopy of stars. "Tomorrow's a big day," he told the rhino, who listened with the peculiar stillness he always adopted when James spoke directly to him. "You might meet some of your own kind. Be patient with them. They didn't have the advantage of your excellent upbringing." Nkosi snorted softly, his warm breath clouding in the cool night air. 6 months into the transition, the inevitable happened. Nkosi encountered a small group of wild rhinos at a distant watering hole. James watched through binoculars, breath held tight in his chest, as the young male cautiously approached the others. 2 females with nearly grown calves and a solitary older male. The interaction was tense, snorts, posturing, a brief charge from one of the females that sent Nkosi backpedaling in surprise. The older male watched the exchange with apparent indifference before deliberately turning his back, neither accepting nor rejecting the newcomer. Nkosi retreated that day, returning to the familiar territory near James's cabin. But something had shifted. A door to his true nature had opened. James observed subtle changes in the following days. More time spent practicing dominance displays against trees, increased vocalization, a new alertness to distant rhino calls. "He's remembering who he really is," Thomas observed during a patrol. Or maybe discovering it for the first time. The next encounter went marginally better. Nkosi maintained his distance, but stayed at the watering hole even after the other rhinos noticed him. A week later, he was allowed to drink while the others watched warily. Progress came in tiny increments, measured in seconds of tolerance, feet of decreased distance, the subtle body language of tentative acceptance. Over the following months, Nkosi's visits to James's cabin became less frequent. Sometimes a week would pass before James would spot the distinctive pattern of notches on Nkosi's ears. Battle scars from early encounters with the reserve's other rhinos. Each time, the reunion was joyful but briefer, Nkosi allowing James to check him for injuries before wandering back toward the heart of the reserve. "It's working," Dr. Mbeki confirmed during one of her assessment visits. "He's navigating rhino society, not without challenges, but he's finding his place." James felt pride mingled with a growing sense of obsolescence. His daily journals tracking Nkosi's behavior grew shorter as direct observations became less frequent. The reserve staff became his primary source of information, their radio updates a lifeline to Nkosi's new existence. "He's formed a tentative alliance with 2 younger males," reported a tracker one afternoon. "They've been seen grazing together near the eastern boundary. Typical bachelor group behavior." By the time Nkosi turned 5, the transition was deemed complete. The special enclosure was opened entirely, allowing Nkosi complete freedom within the reserve. James maintained his cabin, spending weekends and holidays there, but returned to his veterinary practice full-time. The separation wasn't without its difficult moments. During a particularly violent thunderstorm, James was awakened by familiar sounds outside his cabin. Nkosi had returned, seeking the comfort of his first protector. During a bout of illness that required veterinary intervention, Nkosi allowed only James to administer the necessary injections, recognizing his touch even through fever-induced confusion. By the time Nkosi turned 7, his visits had dwindled to monthly occurrences. James had adjusted to his new role as occasional visitor in Nkosi's life rather than daily caretaker. The reserve staff kept him updated on Nkosi's movements, reporting that his alliance with the other young males had strengthened into a stable bachelor group that patrolled a significant territory. "You did the impossible," Dr. Mbeki told James during a chance meeting in town. "You raised a wild rhino who's actually returned to the wild. Do you know how rare that is? Most hand-reared orphans never fully reintegrate. They become too dependent, too humanized." James nodded, pride mingling with a parent's inevitable sense of loss. "He was never mine to keep." "No," she agreed, "but you'll always be part of him. That kind of bond doesn't simply disappear." What neither of them could have predicted was that Nkosi, despite his new wildlife, had not forgotten the man who had saved him. The bond between them, forged in those desperate first weeks of bottle feedings and lullabies, remained intact beneath the growing armor of adulthood. James occasionally glimpsed evidence of this enduring connection. Like the time a new reserve veterinarian had approached James's cabin, only to be blocked by Nkosi appearing seemingly from nowhere, standing guard until James emerged and introduced them. Or the curious fact that Nkosi's bachelor group territory always seemed to include the area surrounding James's cabin, despite more resource-rich areas elsewhere in the reserve. "He's protecting you," Thomas suggested once. "In his mind, you're still part of his herd." James dismissed the idea as anthropomorphism, but secretly treasured the possibility. And 7 years later, that bond would be tested in the most unexpected way. A crisis that would challenge everything James thought he knew about the line between wild and tame, animal and human, love and survival. The eastern boundary of the reserve had always been a point of contention. Unlike the rest of the protected area, which was secured by electric fencing and regular patrols, the eastern section bordered a vast stretch of communal land where villages, farms, and wildlife existed in uneasy proximity. Budget constraints had delayed proper fencing for years, with the natural barrier of the Umfolozi River serving as the primary boundary. But 3 consecutive years of drought had transformed the once formidable river into a series of disconnected pools, creating crossable stretches that wildlife and humans could easily navigate. What had once been a rushing torrent now resembled a tired, broken snake, its back exposed in too many places to count. James had been monitoring the situation with growing concern. His position had evolved over the years. No longer just a veterinarian, he now served as the reserve's director of conservation, overseeing both wildlife health and protection efforts. The promotion had come after his successful work with Nkosi became internationally recognized, bringing attention and funding to the reserve's Rhino protection program. The transition from field veterinarian to administrator hadn't been easy for James. He missed the daily hands-on work with animals, the immediate satisfaction of healing. Now his days were filled with budgets, staff meetings, and endless report writing. But the broader impact he could make, protecting entire species rather than treating individuals, made the sacrifice worthwhile. Usually. The satellite imagery confirms it, James told the board during their quarterly meeting, pointing to the digital maps displayed on the conference room screen. The air conditioning struggled against the summer heat, making the room uncomfortably warm despite the technology cooling the air. At least 7 new crossing points have formed in the past month alone. Our patrol teams can't cover them all. He zoomed in on one particularly concerning area, where the riverbed stretched flat and dry for nearly half a kilometer. This section near Umbando is especially vulnerable. The terrain is easy to navigate, even at night, and it provides direct access to areas where we have high rhino concentrations. The implications hung heavy in the room. Poaching had escalated across the continent, with rhino horn fetching astronomical prices on black markets in Asia. Despite international bans and increased penalties, the financial incentives remained too tempting for criminal syndicates. A single horn could be worth more than gold by weight. A devastating equation that had pushed rhinos to the brink of extinction. We've intercepted 3 separate poaching attempts this quarter, Thomas added, now chief of anti-poaching operations. His face had weathered with age and responsibility, deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much death. They're getting more sophisticated. Night vision equipment, silenced weapons, insider information. It's only a matter of time before they exploit these new access points. Magdalene Jerry, the newest board member and representative from the National Wildlife Authority, leaned forward. What about relocating the most vulnerable rhinos to the western sector until the fence is completed? James shook his head. Rhinos are territorial. Forcing them to relocate causes extreme stress and can lead to conflict with established populations. Not to mention the logistical challenges and risks of tranquilizing and moving animals of that size. Then we need more boots on the ground, insisted Robert Kumalo, the board's chairman. Temporary measures until the fence is completed. The board approved emergency funding for additional patrols, but the true solution, completing the eastern fence, remained months away. In the meantime, the reserve's rhinos were increasingly vulnerable. James left the meeting with a heaviness in his chest that had become all too familiar. Back in his office, he pulled up the tracking data for the reserve's monitored rhinos. Each animal, represented by a colored dot on his screen, told a story of survival against increasing odds. His eyes inevitably sought out the blue marker representing Nkosi, now a magnificent bull in his prime, at 10 years old. Recent reports placed his bachelor group near the eastern sector, drawn by the remnant water sources that still existed along the river's course. The thought of Nkosi wandering into danger kept James awake at night. Unlike most of the reserve's rhinos, Nkosi had no innate fear of humans, a potentially fatal flaw in a world where human contact often meant death. He trusts too easily, James murmured to the empty office, tracing Nkosi's recent movements on the screen. That's my fault. Dr. Mbeki, now the reserve's senior veterinarian, had tried to reassure him during their last conversation. He's been wild for years now, James. He's learned caution from the other bulls. Stop torturing yourself. But James couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility that had defined his relationship with Nkosi from the beginning. Some nights, he dreamed of the tiny orphaned calf, eyes wide with terror and loss, and woke with the phantom weight of that responsibility pressing on his chest. On a sweltering Tuesday in February, James was reviewing veterinary records in his office when his radio crackled to life, the static cutting through the drone of his desk fan. "Director, we have a situation at Checkpoint Echo. Possible boundary breach. Tracking team requesting assistance." The voice belonged to Namsa, the Operations Center coordinator, her typically calm tone edged with urgency. James grabbed his field kit and headed out immediately, pausing only to check his sidearm, a precaution he'd been forced to adopt in recent years as confrontations with armed poachers became more frequent. The weight of the pistol against his hip remained the uncomfortable reminder of how the conservation landscape had changed. He radioed Thomas as he drove, the Land Rover bouncing violently over the rutted dirt roads. "I'm heading to Echo. What's your position?" "Overseeing a training exercise at the north fence," Thomas replied, his voice breaking up slightly over the radio. "I can redirect a team, but they'll be at least 40 minutes behind you." "Do it," James confirmed. "I'll assess and report back." Checkpoint Echo was one of the new monitoring stations established along the eastern boundary, positioned at a recently formed crossing point. Little more than a camouflaged observation post with basic equipment, it represented their tenuous hold on the increasingly porous boundary. When he arrived, the tracking team was already following spoor leading from the riverbed into the reserve. Sifo Ndlovu, a man whose tracking skills were legendary throughout the region, crouched near a disturbed patch of earth, studying minute details invisible to untrained eyes. 3 sets of human tracks, explained Sifo, pointing to the distinctive boot prints in the soft sand. His weathered face betrayed no emotion, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. They crossed about 2 hours ago, moving fast, heading northwest. James knelt beside him, noting the depth of the impressions. "Carrying heavy equipment?" Sifo nodded. "And see here." He indicated a faint parallel line occasionally visible alongside the footprints. "Dragging something, possibly a rifle case or supply bag." Toward the Umbando waterhole, James realized with a sinking feeling. It was one of the few remaining water sources in this section, and a frequent gathering point for wildlife, including rhinos. The tracking data he'd reviewed earlier flashed in his mind. Nkosi had been recorded near Umbando just yesterday. They radioed for backup and began following the tracks, moving cautiously through the dense bush. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with moisture from an approaching storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance as dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising relief from the heat, but complicating their tracking efforts. The team consisted of James, Sifo, and 2 junior rangers, Thabo and Lindiwe, both in their first year with the anti-poaching unit. James noted their nervous energy with concern. Confrontations with poachers were increasingly violent, and these young rangers had yet to experience direct conflict. "Stay focused," he advised them quietly as they moved. "Remember your training. If we encounter suspects, we observe and report. We don't engage unless absolutely necessary." After an hour of tracking, Sifo froze, raising his hand for silence. Just ahead, barely visible through the acacia thickets, 3 figures crouched near the dried mud flats surrounding the waterhole. They carried long rifles with distinctive silencers, poachers without question. Through his binoculars, James could make out details that confirmed his worst fears. These weren't opportunistic local poachers, but professionals. Their camouflage gear, tactical positioning, and equipment spoke of military training and substantial financial backing. One man operated what appeared to be a sophisticated tracking device, likely monitoring the same wildlife data the reserve used. And beyond them, oblivious to the danger, Nkosi and his two bachelor companions had emerged from the opposite tree line, heading toward the water. Even at this distance, James could identify Nkosi by the distinctive pattern of his horn and the slight limp in his right foreleg, the result of an injury sustained years earlier during a territorial dispute. James's heart hammered against his ribs. The anti-poaching team was still 20 minutes out. The storm was moving in fast, radio communication becoming increasingly unreliable with each crack of thunder. They were outnumbered, and the poachers were better armed. "We need to distract the rhinos," James whispered, formulating a desperate plan. "Drive them back into the bush before the poachers get a clean shot." Lindewi, the youngest ranger, nodded. "I can circle around to the eastern side and create a disturbance." "Too risky," Sifo countered. "They'd spot you crossing the open ground." But before they could settle on a plan, a sudden downpour erupted from the darkened sky. The deluge created instant chaos. The poachers scrambling for cover, the rhinos startling at the sudden change. The rain came down in sheets so thick it reduced visibility to mere meters, transforming the landscape into a blur of gray and green. In the confusion, one of the poachers spotted the tracking team and opened fire. The first shot went wide, splintering bark from a tree near James's head. The second found its mark in Sifo's shoulder, sending the tracker crumpling to the ground with a muffled cry that barely carried over the storm's roar. James dragged Sifo behind a fallen log as bullets continued to pepper their position. The injured tracker's blood mixed with rainwater, creating pale crimson streams that snaked across the saturated ground. Thabo returned fire, forcing the poachers to seek better cover. While Lindewi radioed their coordinates to the approaching backup team, her voice remarkably steady despite the chaos. The gunfire sent the rhinos into a panic. Two fled immediately, disappearing into the thick brush with surprising speed for animals of their size. But Nkosi, whether through confusion or some primal instinct, charged toward the sound of conflict. Time seemed to slow as James watched in horror. Nkosi thundered across the open ground, a living tank of muscle and rage, directly toward the poacher's position. One of the men swung his rifle toward the charging rhino, taking aim at the massive head where the precious horn protruded like a crown. Without thinking, James broke cover, waving his arms and shouting at the top of his lungs, his voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "Nkosi, stop!" What happened next would later be described by the surviving witnesses as nothing short of miraculous. The massive rhino, in full charge, somehow recognized the voice that had comforted him as a calf. He swerved, missing the poacher by mere feet, and skidded to a halt in the rain-soaked earth, his massive body sliding slightly in the mud before regaining balance. For one impossible moment, rhino and man locked eyes across the chaotic scene. A connection spanning years of shared history cutting through the pandemonium of gunfire and storm. In that moment, James saw recognition in those ancient eyes. A flicker of the orphaned calf still present in the formidable bull. The distraction gave the anti-poaching team, arriving at last from the south, the opportunity they needed. They quickly surrounded and apprehended two of the poachers, who surrendered when they realized they were outgunned. The third escaped into the bush, but was captured the following day by a patrol near the river crossing, exhausted and dehydrated after spending a night lost in unfamiliar territory. In the aftermath, as medics attended to Saifo's wound, James approached Nkosi cautiously. The Rhino remained at the edge of the clearing, watching the human activity with what seemed like deliberate interest. The rain had eased to a gentle patter, creating a silvery curtain between man and beast. "You recognize me," James said softly as he drew near, his clothes soaked through, mud caking his boots. "After all this time, you still knew my voice." Nkosi snorted, shaking his massive head as raindrops scattered from his ears. He allowed James to approach within a few yards, closer than he had permitted in years, before turning slowly and ambling back toward the safety of the thickets, pausing once to look back, as if ensuring James was safe. The incident made international headlines. Rehabilitated Rhino saves former caretaker from poachers. Conservation groups seized on the story as evidence of the deep bonds possible between humans and wildlife, and donations poured in to complete the reserve's eastern fence. James found himself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight, giving interviews and appearing at fundraising events where he recounted the story of Nkosi's rescue and their unexpected reunion. It wasn't just luck, he told a journalist from National Geographic during a widely shared interview. It was recognition. Nkosi and I shared a connection that transcended his return to the wild. In that moment of crisis, he remembered. The publicity brought much-needed attention to the reserve's conservation efforts, but it also created unexpected complications. The increased visibility made Nkosi a target of interest, both for tourists eager to spot the famous rhino and, more worryingly, for poachers seeking high-profile trophies. "We need to be careful about how much information we share about his whereabouts," Thomas warned during a staff meeting 2 weeks after the incident. "The story has made him valuable in ways we didn't anticipate." James agreed, implementing new protocols that restricted tracking data access and limited guided tours to areas away from Nkosi's known territory. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, not just in the reserve's operations, but in his relationship with the animal he had raised. The interrogation of the captured poachers revealed disturbing information. They weren't working independently, but as part of a sophisticated syndicate with connections to international wildlife trafficking networks. More concerning was the evidence suggesting they had inside information about the reserve's patrol schedules and vulnerable boundary points. "We have a leak," Thomas concluded grimly during a confidential briefing with James and the board chairman. "Someone with access to our security protocols is feeding information to the syndicate." The revelation cast a shadow over the reserve staff, introducing an element of suspicion that poisoned the previously close-knit community. James found himself scrutinizing longtime colleagues, wondering who might have been compromised. The weight of this new threat, combined with his administrative responsibilities and continued concern for Nkosi's safety, left him exhausted. One evening, a month after the incident, James returned to his cabin on the reserve, the same one he had occupied during Nkosi's transition years earlier. Though he now had a proper house in the nearby town, he still maintained this simple dwelling as a retreat and base for extended field operations. As he sat on the porch, nursing a glass of whiskey and watching the sunset paint the landscape in amber and gold, a movement at the tree line caught his attention. A massive shape emerged from the shadows, moving with deliberate purpose toward the cabin. Nkosi. The rhino approached to within 20 meters of the porch, closer than he had come in years, and stood watching James with that same inscrutable gaze from the day of the confrontation. There was no fear in his posture, no aggression, just a quiet presence that seemed to demand acknowledgement. "Hello, old friend," James said softly, remaining seated to appear non-threatening. "Checking up on me?" Nkosi snorted, pawing the ground once before settling into a relaxed stance. For nearly an hour, the rhino remained, occasionally grazing on the sparse vegetation, but always keeping James in his sight. As darkness fell, he finally turned and disappeared back into the bush, leaving James with a profound sense of having been visited rather than merely encountered. The visits continued, once a week at first, then more frequently. Always at dusk, always with the same quiet vigilance. James began to structure his evenings around these encounters, ensuring he was at the cabin when Nkosi was most likely to appear. Dr. Mbeki, when told about the visits, was fascinated. "It's unprecedented," she admitted. "We know rhinos are intelligent. But this level of sustained recognition and deliberate interaction years after returning to the wild, it challenges our understanding of their cognitive capabilities." For James, the visits represented something beyond scientific interest. They were a reconnection with the purpose that had driven him since those first desperate days with an orphaned calf, a purpose that had sometimes gotten lost in the bureaucracy and politics of his administrative role. But for James, the significance went deeper. The connection he and Nkosi shared had transcended years of separation and the pull of wild instinct. In that critical moment, their paths had crossed again with profound consequences. Now, these regular visits suggested something more enduring than chance, a deliberate maintenance of their bond that defied conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. What James couldn't know was that this encounter was only the beginning. The poaching attempt, while thwarted, was part of a larger, more sinister operation targeting the reserve, one that would soon force James and Nkosi together again in ways neither could anticipate. As March gave way to April, intelligence reports indicated increased activity along the eastern boundary. Despite enhanced patrols and accelerated work on the fence, the syndicate appeared to be planning something significant. Drone surveillance captured images of vehicles gathering in remote areas beyond the reserve's jurisdiction, and informants in local communities reported strangers asking questions about the reserve's famous rhinos. "They're planning something big," Thomas reported during an emergency security meeting. "Possibly a coordinated incursion with multiple teams. Our sources suggest they're specifically targeting Nkosi now. His horn would be a trophy worth millions on the black market." The revelation hit James like a physical blow. His efforts to protect Nkosi through publicity had backfired spectacularly, transforming the rhino from one of many into a high-value target. "We need to consider temporary relocation," suggested Magdalene and Jerry from the Wildlife Authority. "Perhaps to a secure facility until the threat is neutralized." James shook his head vehemently. Capturing and relocating him would be traumatic. He's finally found his place in the wild. I won't take that from him again. Instead, they implemented an intensive protection plan. Round-the-clock monitoring of Nkosi's territory, rapid response teams stationed at strategic points, and accelerated completion of the eastern fence sections nearest to his known range. But even as these measures were put in place, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. The syndicate had demonstrated sophisticated planning and inside information. Would these obvious countermeasures be enough to deter them? Or were they simply setting the stage for a more elaborate trap? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, and in a form that would test the limits of the bond between man and animal to its breaking point. The first sign of trouble came not from the eastern boundary, as everyone had expected, but from within the reserve itself. On a clear morning in early May, James was awakened by an urgent call from the operations center. "Sir, we've lost contact with Patrol Team Bravo," reported Namsa, her voice tight with concern. They missed 2 scheduled check-ins during their night patrol of the southern sector. James was immediately alert, sleep forgotten. Any radio communication at all? Emergency signals? Nothing since 2300 hours? Their vehicle tracker is also offline. That's deliberate tampering, James concluded grimly. Who was on that patrol? Ranger Davies and the new recruit, Mbali. James dressed quickly, his mind racing through possibilities. None of them good. The southern sector was far from the eastern boundary that had been their focus of concern. A relatively secure area with established infrastructure and regular patrols. If something had happened there, it suggested a level of infiltration they hadn't anticipated. As he drove toward the operations center, the radio crackled with another report. The reserve's perimeter alarm system had gone down in multiple sectors simultaneously. What had seemed like an isolated incident was rapidly revealing itself as something far more coordinated. It's happening now, James realized, accelerating down the dirt road. This isn't preparation, it's the attack itself. The operations center was in controlled chaos when he arrived. Thomas had already established an emergency command post, coordinating the remaining patrol teams to secure key areas and locate the missing rangers. We've got multiple breaches, Thomas reported, pointing to the digital map where red indicators flashed at various points along the reserve's boundary. At least 3 separate entry points. And this, he indicated a cluster of alerts in the central sector. Suggests they're already well inside our perimeter. How many intruders? Drone thermal imaging suggests at least 12 individuals, moving in 4 groups of 3, heavily armed based on their profiles. James studied the map, a cold realization forming. They're not random. Look at their convergence pattern. He traced the projected paths of the intruders with his finger. They're all heading toward the same area. The location was unmistakable. The territory where Nkosi and his bachelor group had established themselves. The latest tracking data showed the Rhinos had been in that vicinity consistently for the past week, drawn by one of the few remaining water sources unaffected by the drought. They knew exactly where he would be, James said, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. This isn't opportunistic, it's targeted. And the coordination, the system failures. This goes beyond having a leak. We've been compromised at a fundamental level. Thomas nodded grimly. The question is who, and how do we respond now? James made a rapid series of decisions. Lock down all access to our tracking systems. Switch to analog communications only. No digital channels. And I want every available ranger converging on Nkosi's location. That leaves other areas vulnerable, Thomas pointed out. They don't want other rhinos today. They want him. The certainty in James's voice left no room for argument. This is personal now. As the response teams mobilized, James made his way to the armory. Though primarily an administrator now, he still maintained his certification for field operations and firearms. Today, he would need those skills. The southern sky had begun to darken with gathering storm clouds as James joined a rapid response team heading toward Nkosi's last known location. The weather would complicate their drone surveillance, but might also hamper the poachers' operations, a mixed blessing at best. Latest thermal imaging shows Nkosi separated from the other bulls, reported Lindiwe, now a senior ranger, as their vehicle bounced over the rugged terrain. He's alone near the western edge of the territory. That's not normal behavior for him, James noted with growing concern. Nkosi typically stayed close to his bachelor group, particularly during vulnerable periods like drinking or resting. Could he be injured? No unusual movement patterns to suggest injury, Lindiwe replied, checking the data. It's almost as if He's being drawn away. James finished the thought. Deliberately isolated. They were still 5 kilometers from Nkosi's position when the radio crackled with an urgent report from another team. Command. We've found Ranger Davies. He's alive but severely injured. No sign of Mbali. A brief pause then. Davies says Mbali betrayed them, disabled their vehicle and communications, then left him for dead. Says she's working with the poachers. The revelation landed like a thunderbolt. Mbali and Zimandi had joined the reserve staff just 6 months earlier, coming highly recommended with impressive credentials from another conservation area. She had integrated quickly, shown exceptional aptitude, and gained access to sensitive information about patrol schedules and tracking systems. It was never a leak, James realized. It was infiltration. They placed her here specifically for this operation. The implications were staggering. How long had they been planning this? How much did they know about the reserve's security protocols? And most critically, what else had been compromised that they didn't yet know about? As they approached the coordinates of Nkosi's last known position, James ordered the vehicle to stop a kilometer out. We continue on foot from here. They'll be watching the access roads. The team spread out in a standard search formation, moving silently through the bush with practiced efficiency. The air hung heavy with the promise of rain, the gathering storm painting the landscape in ominous shadows. James took point, his senses hyper-alert to every sound and movement. The familiar territory now felt alien, threatening. Somewhere ahead was Nkosi, possibly already in danger, possibly already. He couldn't complete the thought. A distant crack of gunfire shattered the tense silence. Not the sharp report of a high-powered rifle, but the distinctive sound of a dart gun, the weapon of choice for poachers who wanted to work without attracting immediate attention. Northeast, approximately half a kilometer. Lindiwe whispered, orienting the team toward the sound. They moved faster now, abandoning some stealth for speed. James's heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a desperate prayer that they weren't too late. The scene they encountered in a small clearing would be forever seared into James's memory. Nkosi was down, his massive body unnaturally still on the rain-dampened earth. 3 figures worked around him with practiced efficiency. One monitoring vital signs, one preparing what appeared to be a chainsaw, and one standing guard with a military-grade assault rifle. And directing their efforts, unmistakable even at this distance, was Mbali. The betrayal cut deep, but there was no time to process it. James signaled the team to spread out, establishing a perimeter around the clearing. They were outnumbered. Thermal imaging had detected additional poachers in the surrounding bush. But they had the element of surprise. "On my signal," James whispered into his radio. "Lindiwe's team takes the armed guard. Thabo, you're on the chainsaw operator. I'll handle Mbali and the medic." The plan was to create enough chaos to prevent them from harming Nkosi further before reinforcements arrived. It was risky, but the alternative, watching them hack off Nkosi's horn while he lay helpless, was unthinkable. James took a deep breath, steadied his aim, and gave the signal. What followed was a blur of action and sound. The Rangers burst from cover simultaneously, shouting commands and firing warning shots. The poachers reacted with practiced precision, dropping to defensive positions and returning fire. In the chaos, James locked eyes with Mbali across the clearing. There was no surprise in her expression, no guilt, only cold calculation as she raised her weapon and fired directly at him. The bullet caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him backward with shocking force. He maintained his footing, adrenaline temporarily masking the pain, and returned fire. His shot went wide as another bullet grazed his thigh. Around him, the skirmish intensified. Lindiwe had successfully neutralized the armed guard, but Thabo was pinned down by fire from the tree line where additional poachers had been hidden. Through the haze of pain and gunfire, James focused on a single objective: reaching Nkosi. The Rhino remained motionless, vulnerable as the battle raged around him. James advanced, using scattered trees for cover, returning fire when possible. The distance to Nkosi seemed to stretch impossibly, each meter gained costing precious seconds and exposing him to enemy fire. A sudden, deafening thunderclap directly overhead startled both sides momentarily. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke, unleashing a deluge that transformed the battlefield in seconds. Visibility dropped dramatically as sheets of rain obscured the clearing. James used the distraction to make his final approach to Nkosi. The Rhino's breathing was shallow but steady, tranquilized but alive. No irreversible damage had been done yet. The chainsaw lay abandoned nearby, its operator now engaged in the firefight. "I've got you," James murmured, positioning himself protectively beside the massive animal. From this position, he could defend Nkosi while maintaining a line of fire toward the poachers. Through the curtain of rain, he saw Mbali shouting into a radio, likely calling for extraction or reinforcements. The operation was falling apart, their carefully orchestrated plan disrupted by the Rangers' arrival and the unexpected storm. The gunfire began to slacken as the poachers, realizing their objective was now out of reach, started to withdraw. Standard procedure would be to pursue, but with Nkosi vulnerable and their own numbers limited, James made the call to hold position. "Secure the perimeter," he ordered. "Reinforcements are 3 minutes out. Nobody approaches the Rhino." As the sound of combat faded, replaced by the steady drumming of rain, James allowed himself to assess his own injuries. The shoulder wound was bleeding steadily, and the leg graze burned like fire, but neither appeared immediately life-threatening. He applied pressure to the shoulder, grimacing at the pain that adrenaline had temporarily masked. Beside him, Nkosi's breathing had strengthened slightly. The tranquilizer was powerful but measured, designed to immobilize without killing, allowing the poachers time to remove the horn and escape before the animal recovered. "You're going to be okay," James told the unconscious Rhino, his voice barely audible above the storm. "They didn't get what they came for. You're safe now." But even as he spoke the reassurance, James knew it wasn't truly over. The operation had failed, but the threat remained. Mbali had escaped in the confusion, and with her went intimate knowledge of the reserve security systems, patrol patterns, and Nkosi's habits. They would try again, perhaps with even greater determination after this costly failure. The reinforcement team arrived minutes later, securing the area and beginning emergency medical treatment for the injured. 2 poachers had been captured, 1 fatally wounded, and the others had escaped into the bush where additional teams were now pursuing them. As a medic worked on his shoulder, James maintained his vigil beside Nkosi. The rain had eased to a gentle patter, and the first hints of the Rhino's recovery were becoming evident. Twitching ears, deeper breathing, the occasional rumbling snort. "We need to move you to the medical station, sir," the medic insisted. "That shoulder needs proper attention." "Not until he's on his feet," James replied with quiet determination. "I won't leave him vulnerable again." Understanding the futility of argument, the medic did what he could in the field, cleaning and bandaging both wounds before moving on to other injured Rangers. As the clearing was secured and evidence collected, Thomas arrived to assess the situation personally. His expression was grim as he knelt beside James. "We've got 4 in custody, including the 2 you captured here. They're not talking yet, but we will get answers." "And Mbali?" Thomas shook his head. "No sign. She knows our tracking methods too well, but we'll find her." "She was the key," James said, wincing as he shifted position. "This entire operation was built around her infiltration. The timing, the coordination, the inside knowledge. This has been in motion for months. The question is why?" Thomas mused. "Why such an elaborate operation for a single Rhino, even one as valuable as Nkosi?" Before James could respond, a rumbling grunt drew their attention. Nkosi was beginning to stir, his massive head lifting slightly before dropping back to the earth. The tranquilizer was wearing off gradually, as expected. "Everyone back," James ordered, struggling to his feet despite the pain. "Give him space to recover. No sudden movements, no loud noises." The Rangers retreated to a respectful distance, maintaining the perimeter, but allowing the Rhino room to regain his senses without feeling threatened. James remained closest, though still at a safe distance. Nkosi's recovery was gradual. First the twitching ears and tail, then the lifting head, and finally the tremendous effort to roll onto his sternum. Each movement was labored, the powerful muscles still fighting the effects of the tranquilizer. When Nkosi finally gained his feet, swaying slightly with lingering disorientation, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the assembled Rangers. The Rhino's head swung toward the sound, ears pivoting forward. But there was no sign of aggression in his posture, only confusion. His gaze eventually settled on James, who stood motionless, allowing Nkosi to process his presence. For a long moment, man and beast regarded each other across the rain-soaked clearing. Then, with deliberate steps, Nkosi approached. Rangers raised their rifles instinctively. A tranquilized Rhino regaining consciousness was unpredictable at best, dangerous at worst. But James raised his hand, signaling them to hold position. "It's okay," he said softly, though whether to Nkosi or the Rangers wasn't entirely clear. "We understand each other." Nkosi stopped a few meters away, his massive head lowered slightly, nostrils flaring as he processed James's scent. Then, in a gesture that would later be described in dozens of reports and testimonies, the Rhino extended his neck and gently, almost imperceptibly, nudged James's uninjured arm with his snout before turning and ambling slowly toward the safety of the trees. The significance of the moment was lost on no one present. This wasn't the confused action of a sedated animal, but a deliberate acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude, from one sentient being to another. As Nkosi disappeared into the bush, James finally allowed himself to be led toward the medical vehicle. The immediate crisis had passed, but the larger threat remained. The failed operation had revealed the depths of their vulnerability and the lengths to which their enemies would go. "We need to completely overhaul our security protocols," he told Thomas as they drove back toward the reserve headquarters. "New communication systems, new patrol patterns, new tracking methods. Everything Mbali had access to needs to be changed." Thomas nodded grimly. "Already in progress. But there's something else we need to consider." He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to suggest. "We need to evaluate whether keeping Nkosi in the reserve is still viable. He's become too high profile, too targeted." The suggestion hit James like a physical blow. "You're talking about permanent relocation to a facility with maximum security, perhaps even internationally, where the syndicates have less reach." James stared out at the passing landscape, the familiar terrain that had been Nkosi's home for most of his life. The thought of removing him from it, of confining that wild spirit to a protected enclosure for his remaining years, was almost unbearable. But so was the thought of failing him, of arriving minutes too late the next time. "Let me think about it," James finally replied. "There has to be another way." As the medical team treated his wounds back at the reserve clinic, James's mind worked through possibilities. The events of the day had demonstrated both the immense threat to Nkosi and the remarkable bond that still existed between them. Perhaps in that bond lay a solution that neither complete freedom nor complete confinement could offer. What he couldn't know was that the day's events had set in motion forces that would soon present an even more impossible choice. One that would test not just their bond, but the very definition of freedom, captivity, and the relationship between humans and the wild creatures they sought to protect. The storm had passed, but the horizon remained dark with gathering clouds. Another tempest was coming, one that would shake the reserve and James's world to its very foundations. 3 days after the attack, James reviewed security footage showing Mbali's betrayal. His shoulder throbbed beneath fresh bandages as he studied how she had methodically infiltrated their systems. The board arrived with unwelcome news. Nkosi would be relocated to a sanctuary in Switzerland within the month. The decision was final. "Switzerland?" James asked incredulously. "You want to send an African rhino to the Alps?" "We want to keep him alive," Khumalo countered. "The syndicate will try again." That night, James made his own decision. When Nkosi made one of his regular visits to the cabin, James led him to a hidden valley in the reserve's remote western sector, a place with a natural spring, abundant vegetation, and terrain so inaccessible it appeared on few maps. "This is your sanctuary now," James told him. "No fences, no scheduled feedings, no tourists. Just you and the land." He activated a specialized tracking implant known only to him, then returned to face mounting suspicions. As the Swiss transport team's arrival date approached, pressure intensified. Dr. Mbeki finally confronted him directly. "You've relocated him, haven't you? The board will fire you, possibly press charges. If that's the price for doing what I believe is right, I'll pay it." Dr. Mbeki offered a compromise, a new conservation model being developed by the National Wildlife Authority. Protected zones within existing reserves with minimal human intervention, natural boundaries, and comprehensive security. After tense negotiations, a solution emerged. Nkosi would remain in the hidden valley, now designated Protected Zone Alpha. James would oversee the project, effectively removed from broader administrative duties, but maintaining his connection with Nkosi. 2 weeks later, James watched from a rocky outcrop as Nkosi grazed peacefully below, unperturbed by the minimal monitoring stations and distant security post. "Was it worth it?" Dr. Mbeki asked. "Even though your career has effectively plateaued?" James smiled. "There are worse places to plateau than watching over him. We started this journey together when he was small enough to fit in my living room. Seems fitting we continue it together now." The Protected Zone initiative would eventually expand across the continent, with James as its most passionate advocate. And Nkosi would live out his days in that hidden valley, not entirely wild, not entirely managed, but existing in that rare balance where human care and natural freedom found harmony.